for being with us this morning for our first wellness event for 2025. So we're glad to have you here with us on this very busy weekend. And we're very grateful to have Kendra Seymour with us, who's going to be presenting on grief and loss. I invite you to join us in the acknowledgement of territory. The Creator, overflowing with love, breathed all of creation into being. We acknowledge that the land on which we live, work, and worship today is the land traditionally cared for by the Anishinaabe, Arawandran, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. Our ancestors came, either most practices of land ownership that led to broken relationships. We acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the indigenous people with whom we share this land today. We long for reconciliation with our indigenous citizens, so that together we can prepare for creation and share the land with resources as creators. So it's my privilege to introduce Kendra this morning. We've known Kendra since grade 3, kindergarten. So Kendra grew up in Bridgeport and attended school with our middle daughter Helen, and they have been friends pretty well ever since. I guess met at university days. Re-met, and so the grandkids hang out together. Kendra worked at Lutherwood with young people for many years, and then she moved to Luther Village and worked there for 2 years, and now she has her own private practice. And of course, we really appreciated your conversation on May last year, so we're glad to have you back.
I was invited back to speak on grief and loss, and so I do want to acknowledge it's not an easy topic. It's all about emotion, right, and hard emotions. I'll also talk a bit about in the presentation how it's often an emotion individuals and society doesn't want to acknowledge, feel, recognize, that sort of thing. So I just want to acknowledge that it can be a tough conversation. So if you need to take a break, please do. And if there's any follow-up or conversations that might be helpful, and we've got lots of great supports within the church, I'm happy to touch base afterwards as well. Yeah, so how to introduce me a little bit. So again, I'm Kendra Seymour. Known the Leffler family for many years. And so now I am a registered psychotherapist. So that's with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, big fancy name, CRPO. I'm also certified in death, dying, and bereavement. So it's a certificate through Wilfrid Laurier University. And as mentioned, lots of experience working with youth, families, as well as seniors over the last couple of years. Really recognizing though grief touches everyone. And so currently working in private practice in Kitchener, Thriving Families Counseling, so doing that full time at this point. And so what we're going to touch on today, going to take a look at definitions, causes of grief, getting some understanding of grief, symptoms, what can grief look like, how to cope for yourself, as well as how to help others in their time of grief, and then where you can find some more support. So jumping in, there's a few definitions, so bear with me if it's a little technical. So first of all, bereavement. Bereavement is the state of being deprived of something that you had an attachment to or relationship with. So it's that state of loss. Whereas grief is our personal reaction to that. So this is where we have those emotions, the behaviors, the social impacts, physical, those sorts of things. And then mourning, that is our public representation. That's what other people can see in us. So that's kind of where the differences are. These terms are very often used interchangeably. So typically, just use grief. Grief kind of encompasses it all. So having those definitions, if you're comfortable too, who here has experienced any of these? Bereavement, mourning, grief, anybody? Pretty much everybody, right? And that's what I mean when grief touches everybody. And so it's something that everybody experiences, but few acknowledge. And so even within that grief piece, there are a couple specific types of grief I want to just highlight. So there is this diagnosis thing called prolonged grief or complicated grief. So this is actually something you can be diagnosed with, which in and of itself is controversial, right? Grief is a normal process, but some people have a harder time with grief. And so this is typically when grief is intense, and then that maladaptive word is really important. So basically when grief gets in the way of being successful in life. So it can be diagnosed if it's a year after the loss, if it's 6 months after a loss for kids. So a little bit different there, but in the professional world, there's a little bit of controversy around, is this really a thing, or is this just natural grief that the world doesn't know how to recognize? There's also something on the other end of that, anticipatory grief. So this is a grief that we can start to feel before the loss. So when there's something like a maid's death, or when there's a cancer diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis. So anything kind of beforehand as we're preparing for that loss would fall under that anticipatory grief. There's also this disenfranchised grief. I always think that's a cool word, disenfranchised. But really what it means is that this is the grief that we can't really acknowledge. So this is something that is seen as socially inappropriate or things that we can't recognize. So the best example I was given was the idea of someone who might be in a marriage but having a lover. That if that lover were to die, we can't necessarily recognize that loss. This can be also for things where we shouldn't care, right? And I'll talk a bit about too, like celebrity deaths, right? Sometimes can be seen as a disenfranchised grief because it's a celebrity, right? Like it's not something that we're going to be sad at home about. It's just how things happen in the world. And so this is when that grief is not able to be recognized. Any questions? That's lots of different terms and whatnot. Any questions about any of that? Makes sense? Perfect. So then when it comes to causes of grief. So grief, yes, is the loss or the death of someone that you have an attachment to or that you love. Grief can also be from the death of a pet. Anybody here experience that? Death of a pet? Really feel that grief? Absolutely, right? It's sometimes surprising how much that loss can impact us, right? Where, again, this can be part of that disenfranchised grief. It's just a pet. It's just a dog. It's just a hamster to a kid, right? But it really means something, right? And so that's where we can feel that grief. Grief can also happen not related to death. So grief can happen when we're looking at something like a job loss, whether or not that was your choice can come play into that, but it can be job loss because you were fired. It can be job loss because you moved on to somewhere else. This is one that, I can say that I've experienced. I worked at Lutherwood for 15 years, and then I made the decision to move out to private practice. It was my choice, but I still mourn that loss. It was a significant part of my life, significant friendships there that I don't have the same anymore, right? It's all that loss that you can really feel. Moving, again, can cause some of that grief and loss, right? Especially when we look at our kids, when they're losing not necessarily just their home, but their school and their friends and the familiarity of the neighborhood and those sorts of things. Relationship breakups are also something that can cause grief. Again, if it's our choice or not, it can still cause, it's that loss, right, that we can miss even if it is our choice. We can also experience grief when the event's at a distance. So like I mentioned, that celebrity passing can be felt as grief. Again, pulling on my personal experiences, Robin Williams was one that definitely hit me that I didn't expect, right? I had never experienced something like that before. But it is, again, it's at a distance, never met him, just like the movies, right? But it did hit home a little bit in terms of this is a loss, right? I know there's been a lot going on lately with like the hurricanes and forest fires, right, that are being experienced throughout the world, and wars and those sorts of things, right? Again, they're at a distance, we're not experiencing it, but we can feel the impacts, right? And so that's where we can have that feeling of grief coming in. Any questions about that? Ask as we go. I don't want to be up here just speaking at you, right? So please ask questions as we go here. And so we want to make sure we understand grief. I'm going to spend time on this. I know it was suggested don't spend too much time lecturing. Honestly, part of coping with grief is understanding grief, right? And then so recognizing the impacts, because a lot of grief can be, why am I feeling this way? Why can't I move on? Those sorts of things. So if we have an understanding of it, that in and of itself can help. So I'm going to spend a bit of time on that. So when we look at understanding grief, who's heard of the Kubler-Ross stages of grief? Right, so that's that denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. This has been so widely spread in the commonplace, and realistically, this was developed for people who were dying, not people who were grieving. It got morphed into that, but these stages were originally developed for people who were experiencing end-of-life, terminal illness, those sorts of things. But then mainstream media gets a hold of things shift, and all of a sudden, this is grief. We have stages. Realistically, grief is not in stages. Grief is not linear. We're not going to go from denial to anger to bargaining. It doesn't work like that, right? Even if you want to look at going back and forth between us, it doesn't work like that. You may experience that anger and depression and bargaining all at the exact same time, right? So these are, yes, pieces of what we can experience when we are grieving, but in no way, shape, or form is grief going to be into these nice, neat little categories. Not going to happen. So in the professional world, we've moved towards this dual process model. So just moving out of these stages, out of these, we can call them labels or emotional kinds of things, but into this dual process model. So what that looks like is this idea of moving forward and holding back. So we've got our everyday experience, everything we do in a day. We might be moving into what's called restoration oriented. So that's that moving forward, right? We're noticing the changes in our life after the loss. Might be doing new things, we might be distracted. But we also have that loss oriented piece. And so that's where we sit in the grief. We do the grief work. We are bargaining and in denial and experiencing that anger from that loss. And so healthy grieving is when we can bounce back and forth between these. That we can have those moments of deep grief and we're sobbing and we can't move and we can't get out of bed. We can have those moments. That's okay, that's healthy. We also need those moments of moving forward, right? And so it's this idea that we're oscillating, that's the fancy word they use there, bouncing back and forth, right, between these things. We might end up in one for a day or two, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then we might end up in that loss for a day or two, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, right? It can be short back and forth, it can be moment to moment, right? We can be laughing, having fun with our family. Next moment you go for a bathroom break and you're breaking down, right? That is normal grief. And so we want to be able to recognize that as long as we're having somewhat of a balance of back and forth of these two things, that is healthy grieving. We run into trouble when we get stuck. So if we get stuck in that loss oriented, right? So those are the people that we've all heard of that, yeah, are stuck in bed, can't get out, constantly crying, right? Those sorts of things. That's when it becomes overwhelming and unhealthy, and it's a hard time to be successful moving forward, right? So it might be those times that we're looking to provide some extra support, check in with those people a bit more, that sort of thing. Sometimes people feel like I'm not allowed to be happy. I'm not allowed to move forward. If I move forward, I'm disrespecting or letting go of the person I've lost, right? And so they have a hard time getting into that restoration-oriented piece. On the flip side, we can get stuck in that restoration-oriented. It's easier when we don't feel the hard things, right? So those are the people that are constantly distracted, always on the go, right? People we often think of as coping or masking, right? That if we can just pretend the world is fine, then we're fine, right? Which is fine and dandy, but if we don't pay attention to that loss work, to that grief work, it's going to start poking out in different ways, right? And again, that's where we start to run into troubles as well, because it's not being addressed. I think of it as like sweeping the grief under a rug. It's only going to work so much, and then it's going to start to slide out in different places that you don't expect it, right? So that's what's going to happen if you get stuck in that restoration-oriented piece. So we really want that healthy balance of kind of going back and forth. Any questions about that? Makes sense? Perfect. And so then we talk about timeline. Society's expectations suck. No, straight up there. This drives me nuts when I do grief work, right? We think of that idea of our employers, they give us 3 days. We get 3 days bereavement leave, right? Like, what is that? That is ridiculous. That means nothing. And so We also have that expectation from often family and friends. That was, a month ago, that was a year ago, why are you still grieving, right? What I often want to recognize is that people have this expectation of us and the world moves on. But when we experience that loss, when we experience that grief, the world stops, right? The world really, really stops when we have that loss. That time stopped there. When that person died, our life changed. Whereas the outside world has a really hard time seeing that. And so it is that, why aren't you over it yet? Why haven't we moved on, right? Why can't you get back to work? And all of those expectations. And so I really want to highlight, it's unrealistic, right? In our North American culture, we have that expectation, move on, move forward, keep going, suck it up and move on kind of thing. There are cultures out there that do grief so much better. And our North American culture really, really doesn't do that, right? When we look at Mexico with the Day of the Dead, there are, cultures who dig up the bones of the loved ones every year and clean them and reverence, right? So there's so many others out there that welcome grief and loss into their lives. Whereas in North America, it's move on, right? Keep going, the world keeps ticking, we don't have time for your grief. And so there is no true timeline when it comes to grief. And I'm going to contradict myself and say, have an example graph of a typical grief process, which I think can help understand some things too. So if we look at grief as the kind of up and down and time across the bottom there, when the death happens, our grief spikes, right? That initial, oh my gosh, this person's gone, or I'm moving, or the relationship's over, that sort of thing, right? We have that grief spike. It typically will start to come down again, because this is the time when we got to plan a funeral, we got to figure out the paperwork, we got to figure out the job and insurance and all of that kind of stuff, right? So we get into that restoration-oriented, move forward, we've got to do things, and there is so much paperwork that comes along with a death. It is ridiculous, the amount of things that people have to do, from taking a name off of a car, right? A car ownership, right? And having to present the death certificate yet again, right? To claim insurance, and insurances have their own processes, whether that's, here's the death certificate, or we need the fancy official one that's not going to come for 4 months, and right, there's so much bureaucratic stuff that has to happen around a death, plus the funeral, plus checking in on everybody else, and what do we actually do with the body, and can we, arrange all of these things, right? So there's so many pieces there, and so our grief will typically come down because we're busy with that. And it can stay down for a little bit, again, as we're dealing with all of those things. Typically within that 1 month or so, as we start to get back to reality, after doing a lot of those things, we'll see that grief start to come up and up, right? So it's gonna kind of come back. And so this is where people have a hard time being, it's been 3 months, it's been 6 months, why is it getting worse, right? Because the world is moving on, and it hasn't moved on for us. So at 6 months to a year, we typically have that about our peak-ish, but then that 1 year mark comes. Now it's been a year since I've seen this person. Now it's their birthday. Now it's their Christmas. Now it's, right, it's all of these, people call them anniversaries. Anniversaries are such a happy thing though, so I really don't like that word. Using something like memorial, right? Or just recognizing this is yet another Christmas, birthday year without this person. So around that 1 year, we'll typically see, again, a resurgence in grief. From there, grief can start to peter its way down. Drew this graph with straight lines, and afterwards I was thinking, it's really more like this. Right? There's really no straight lines going on. It is very much those ebbs and flows, right? Those fluctuations. And sometimes, so this graph I have found can be helpful in understanding our typical run of grief, but I know it can also feel like, oh my gosh, the grief is never going to end. Right? And so I want to recognize that yes, grief is something that is always going to be there then, right? This loss is never going to go away. This person's never going to come back. This job's not coming back. The house isn't coming back, whatever it is. Yeah, the grief is going to be there forever, but that doesn't mean it's going to feel as big and bad and awful as it does now. So I love this representation, so that people tend to think grief shrinks over time. Here's how it's not true. That grief is going to be as big and bad as always. But what happens is our jar grows, we grow, right? And so we get other things that come into that jar. It's on my to-do list. I want to make one of these jars someday, but to have that idea of this big bad grief ball in that jar, but as we add more experiences, happy experiences, right, we're going to have those kinds of balls on top of this grief. And so when we stick our hands in this jar each morning, we're going to, as time goes on, more often pull out those happy, more recent experiences. A lot of time though, we're going to stick our hand in there and grab that grief, right? And that's still going to happen. It's going to happen less, but it's still going to be there, right? So we grow around our grief rather than expecting that grief to shrink. Does that make sense? So now when we look at symptoms of grief, people often think of grief as crying, right? That's the typical, we're sad, we're mopey, we have no energy, that sort of thing. So yes, those things are absolutely valid, and there's more to it than that. And so when we look at physical symptoms of grief, grief can cause headaches, sleeping difficulties. This is a big one. I'm pretty biased towards sleep. We need good sleep to function. So when we don't get good sleep, we're starting our day half empty. Right? So this could be really impactful. If the grief is impacting your sleep, and your sleep impacts so much other pieces in our life. Can add to that fatigue, aches and pains can be a part of grief. Dizziness, dry mouth, heaviness in the chest, right? Those emotions physically manifesting in our chest. Nausea, weakened immune systems can impact our appetite, right? All of those kinds of things can be a result of grief, right? It's that physical manifestation of our emotions, and that's going to happen. People again, society again has a hard time understanding, what do you mean you're dizzy because you're grieving, right? Like, what do you mean you're not sleeping well because you're grieving, right? Like, people have a hard time understanding that we often look at physical causes for physical symptoms, whereas emotions, grief can also come out into these physical symptoms, and more. This is just an example. We also have emotions in grief. And so, again, people think of grief as this sadness. When in reality, there's so much more, right? Anger. There's anger. Why would you leave me? Why did this happen, right? That being upset. Shock comes along with it. There's withdrawal, guilt. Didn't spend enough time with this person. Shoulda, coulda, woulda done things differently. Loneliness, right? Especially if it's a partner. There can be this sense of numbness. Again, it's easier to not feel things, right? And if we need that break, that's cool, but we don't want to get stuck in that. And confusion. Something I didn't list on here that can be, again, really challenging for people to accept is relief, right? That sense of relief that a death or a loss can bring, right? I think about it in my presentation last year with MAID, that when people are suffering, right, when people are really struggling with that end-of-life, terminal illness, right, and the autonomy, the dignity that can take from people, and the pain that people deal with, right? So there are times in our grief that we might feel relief, we might feel happiness. There's also times if we are sole caregivers, right? And so if we are providing care to our partner, to our parent who is dying, that can take up a lot of our life. So sometimes there again is relief of, I can move on with my life, I can have some time back to myself, right? And those kinds of things. So we want to recognize that yes, there's these hard, bad emotions, if we want to call it that, but there can also be relief and happiness, right? And being able to have that person not be suffering the same anymore. Does that make sense? And then there's the social impacts, and I think this is what we often will see, right? And this is where we get worried about people when they start withdrawing from those social activities, right? Feeling detached from others, not responding to those social invitations, and canceling their plans, right? It can be really hard to be around people. Again, the world expects us to move on. So if we're deep in our grief and we need to show up to this party or event, people don't want to see us feeling their grief, right? They want us to be happy, they want us to engage, they want it, right? And we might not feel up to that. That might be too much of an ask. And so it's okay to withdraw, right? When we're feeling that big grief, it's okay to have those times to a point, right? When we get to the point where we don't leave our house for a week, then we're looking at that's concerning, right? But if we have many less, social invites or social events that we're attending in the days, weeks, months after the death, that's okay, right? We might need to spend that time in the loss orientation, spend that time in the grief, and we don't have it in us to be in that forward-moving restoration phase. That's okay. But we also need to recognize it's okay too, right? All of these things are okay too. And so then how do we cope, right? This is a challenge. I get people coming to see me that want help with their grief. And so one of the first things I always say too is there's no curing grief, right? I'm not gonna fix it. I'm not gonna make it go away. What we need to focus on is how do we cope so that it doesn't become too much, doesn't impact us too much, and there are times when we feel okay. They're not necessarily good, but there's gonna be times that we're gonna feel okay. And so, yeah, it's about coping, not fixing. Like I said, we need to understand grief, right? So understanding that what we're feeling is normal. What we're feeling is to be expected. Even though North American society doesn't recognize that, these feelings of grief are normal and well within the range. Well, there is a range. Any feeling of grief is normal. It's about how does it impact us in our daily lives moving forward, right? If we're losing our jobs, if we're losing our friends, that's when it becomes a bit concerning. But those feelings are okay. And it's okay to feel all the feelings, right? Yeah, I love this emotion. Really breaks it down, right? When we're kids, we've got kind of these basic emotions: the happy, sad, disgust, anger, fear. Right? Think about Inside Out, the movie, right? These are kind of your basic emotions, but really within that, there's so much more. There's so many more nuances in it, right? And so we might feel, someone who's chosen a maze out, there might be some of that proud, right? Proud that they're able to go through that. We might feel, if we're in that anticipatory grief, we might have some despair, right? It's a little bit different than sadness, right? And so there are so many nuances within the emotions. If anyone's interested in the copy of these, I can send some with Helen. There's some neat websites that have this for reference. And then taking care of yourself. So again, all of the emotions you ever feel when it comes to grief are totally valid. The issue is we want to make sure behaviors aren't as impacted. We still need to eat, we still need to sleep, we still need to take care of ourselves physically. So exercising, whether that's just a walk or meditation or yoga or something, right? We want to make sure our basic bodily needs are being met. So eating, sleeping, exercise, social pieces are super important there as you're able to tone and live. So coping with grief is, taking care of yourself, that is cool. And so connecting with others, right? Again, even if it's the last thing you want to do. And this connecting with others can be that go out, meet where you do things if you're up to that. It can be the 2-word text message, right? It can be quick phone call, it can be a quick email, it can be sending a letter, right? Like it doesn't have to be this physical, in-person kind of connection. It can just be any sort of connection, even if it is, I'll read it later, even if it's, a text message that you don't respond to, but we just want to know other people are out there. I think of it as kind of keeping that door open, right? We don't have to necessarily walk through it and then do all of those things, but staying connected is really important. This is where COVID really impacted grief, right? And so when the world shut down and we're not able to have those times to connect, right? The funerals or even just being able to see people really had an impact on the grief people experienced, right? We started to see more of that disenfranchised grief that, even though it is somebody you allowed to be grieving, we weren't able to express, we weren't able to mourn, we weren't able to gather and show those pieces. So that connection piece is really important. And it's heard from many people, they find it surprising who shows up in their grief and who doesn't. And so those people that you think you can rely on, that are, your ride or die people that are going to show up for you, oftentimes people are surprised who's not able to, right? And so I do want to highlight when it comes to that connection that it's not necessarily that that person doesn't care about you, but it might be more about that person can't handle the grief, right? That they don't know how to handle the emotions, they don't know how to truly provide that support. And so again, we back off, right? We hide from those emotions. And so I would encourage you, if you're experiencing that, or people you thought would show up didn't show up, take it with a grain of salt, right? Try and take it as maybe they're dealing with their own things versus they don't care about you, right? So just, I caution people on that, that people just might not have the capacity to show up as people. And on the flip side, many people have said people showed up that they didn't expect, right? And so there's people that come out of the woodwork sometimes, whether it's that text message, whether it's showing up with a meal, whether it's even just attending a funeral for somebody you haven't seen in 20 years, right? And so there's pros and cons there, but I just highlight that what we think people can handle in grief sometimes can surprise us. But if we can connect in any which way, then that's going to help us through our own grieving process. Staying connected. So this is a big one too, right? And so this is where society sees it's overextended with move on. But for us, that relationship is still going to be there, even if that person is not physically present anymore. So we want to honor that relationship. It doesn't just disappear because they're dead. There's still a relationship. This is why we have graveyards, right? People who are dead don't care if they have a stone. That means nothing to them. Graveyards are for us, who's left behind, right? It's our ability to connect with those people, to be able to go, I know lots of people go and talk to that person, right? So that relationship doesn't disappear. And so staying connected is an important part of that process of grieving. And so things like graveyards, gravestones, right, can be a great way to stay connected. I know lots of people use candles to help represent when people are present. They'll light a candle at dinner, at bedtime, incense, that sort of thing. Having mementos around, so pictures or trophies or that kind of thing. Lots of people set up their like shrines or altars, sometimes they call them, within the home. That's normal, right? That person's still around. It can also be, like I said, talking to that person. I remember as a child when my grandfather died, for years I would talk to him when I went to bed, right? Lying in bed, talk to him. It's that connection piece, right? That person doesn't disappear. It's also the sharing of stories, right? So I work with some people, whose parent has died, right? And so, but they still share those, mom will say, you're so much like your dad, or, dad would have loved to see that, or remember this story of dad, right? Like, that person doesn't disappear, but we need to redefine that relationship we had with them, because we can't continue to make memories the same way, but we're still connected. We can still share those moments with them, we can still remember them, we can still talk to them, right? All of those kinds of things. So finding that way to stay connected can be really important in managing our grief sometimes. And then doing things you enjoy, right? I know there's definitely people out there who struggle with grief and that I don't deserve. Can't be happy after I've lost somebody, right? And so that's something we need to work through, because we can't stay in that emotion and live a successful life, right? When we think about those people, typically wouldn't want us to grieve them forever and never enjoy anything ever again, right? So it's okay, even within grief, even if it's, you're sitting out watching this beautiful sunset and we're crying, cool, right? We can still get out, we can go for a run and cry. We can, still do the things and still have that grief there, but we still need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. And it's okay to distract at times, right? Having that forward-facing piece. And so there's millions of things you can do, right? Reading's a great distraction, movies, walking, yoga, right? Like, there's tons of options. And it can be momentarily, right? It might be 30 seconds, it might be 30 minutes, right? Whatever it is, whatever you need, can help take some time off. Doing this, enjoying ourselves, will also give your body physically a chance to recuperate. So when we're grieving, when we're stressed, we've got those stress hormones flowing through our bodies then, right? We've got the adrenaline, the cortisol, all of those kinds of things happening. So if we're in that constant state, right, our bodies are constantly being flooded with those stress hormones. Excuse me. And so taking the time to distract, to enjoy things, is going to give your body time to flush some of those things out of our system and physically recuperate as well. So it's important to tie in some of those things in order to to feel good and cope with that grief. Any questions on that? Makes sense. And then so, supporting others in their grief. Sometimes I feel like this is harder than coping yourself, right? Because, and I've been asked so many times, right, what superpower would you have? I would 100% of the time think mind reading. That would make life so much easier, right? If we knew what other people are thinking. When we're coping with the grief ourselves, we're in our heads, we know what we're thinking. But to try and help somebody else in their grief is a challenge because we don't know what they need. And grief is so variable that guessing or what we would do in that situation is not necessarily what other people are needing. And so we want to check in, right? And so really we need to start that communication. How are you doing? And again, we're taking it with a grain of salt. If they don't respond to our text or a phone call, that's okay. It's not about we don't want you, we don't care about you, you're not important, you're not helpful. It's gonna be about I'm grieving too much and I can't handle it right now, right? And so we need to give people the grace that they're gonna do things at their own pace. But again, we wanna keep that door open, right? So I always encourage people, it's better to over-communicate, to over-check in, than it is to not check in at all, right? Because then those people are gonna know that you're there. They're gonna know that that door is open. But if we say, okay, well I tried and they didn't respond and throw our hands up and walk away, most likely that person's gonna feel abandoned, right? And so we want to not bombard them, obviously, but we want to keep that door open to say, hey, I'm here if you need me, right? And then we also really need to listen to what they tell us. If they tell us, please don't contact me, then we maybe need to listen to that, right? But if we are hearing them say, I hear you, can't talk right now, right? Like we need to be able to listen to what they're asking for and not assume, right? We have people who will say, I'm good, thanks for checking in, like I'm good. And then we don't want to go, well, you say you're good, but like, are you actually, like, let me just do this anyways, right? Like, we don't want to be doing that, right? We need to take people at their word. We're not in their heads, we can't assume, and they're not us, right? So that check-in is really important. If that person is willing to connect, we really need to listen and be present. So if this person is willing to have a conversation with you, we need to be able to listen. Sometimes our own things are going to get in the way, right? Our own ability to handle grief is going to get in the way of being able to support those other people. And again, that's okay, right? But we need to be aware of that. Really listening and really being present is going to be important. Ultimately, what we're trying to do in all of these pieces for supporting others is to be in the muck with them, right? We want to be able to witness the grief, to recognize the grief, but not fix it, right? And again, as a helper, that's really challenging. But again, grief is not fixable. It's something that we're gonna have to live with, so how do we cope with it? And so that can be a really sticking point when people are trying to be helpful and trying to fix, actually can make the person feel worse, right? And so we really need to listen to them, just be present, just hear them out, and say, wow, that's hard. Practical support can be helpful. Again, listen to the person. They don't want 50 freezer meals because their freezer's only gonna be so big, right? But things like that, helping to make up meals, helping out with chores in the house. I think about like, my relationship with Helen, right? That would just be okay, let's go clean up, right? Like that would be what would be helpful in that moment, right? But again, we need to listen to that person. May not have that relationship to go in the house and clean up, right? It might be, can I cut your lawn for you, right? Can I get that snow shovel for you? Or is there an errand you need me to do? Do you need me to print something off for the insurance? Or right, like it's checking in with like, what can I do to help, right? And so sometimes that's where we can be really honest to say like, I see you're grieving, I really want to help and I don't know how, what can I do? People can be open to that versus, how you doing? What's going on? Right? Like beating around the bush isn't going to get you to the same piece. But to be able to say, you're grieving, I really want to help. What can I do? You're likely going to get some more truthful answers than kind of beating around the bush and, well, I'm guessing and I think, and have that open communication so that you can be that best support. If you're going to ask the questions, be prepared for the answers. Right? So if you're going to ask somebody, how are you doing? Be prepared for, I'm not doing well. I'm grieving, I'm angry, right? Be prepared for that if you're gonna ask those questions. If you're not prepared for that, don't ask the questions, right? What a beautiful day. We don't need to ask how you're doing, right? I know people who are grieving often feel like needing to censor themselves, right? Because we don't wanna dump our grief on other people. Ultimately, it's because other people can't handle it, become uncomfortable, backpedal, right? And so ultimately, if you're gonna be that person, if you're gonna be that support, be prepared for the answers and don't try and fix it, right? The worst thing we can do is have somebody open up to us to say, I'm angry, right? I can't believe this happened. And then getting a response like, oh, well, like that was, the plan and they're better off that way. How invalidating is that, right? But that becomes about us and our responses in that, I don't know how to respond, I just want to make you feel better, right? So I'm gonna throw these cliches at you, throw this advice at you, right? And so that's oftentimes the biggest, or one of the biggest pieces I hear from people, that people just don't understand, and that life isn't better, right? This isn't, the master plan, and this is what, like, it hurts, right? And so people really can feel invalidated when we're throwing these things at them. They're in a better place, and it's for the better, and you'll see the silver lining, right? We're not looking for that silver lining when we're in grief. We need somebody to sit in that storm with us, right? So really, really watching kind of those cliche responses. But again, recognizing these cliche responses happen because we're uncomfortable.
So I took part in a grief group when I was a student, and the minister that was leading it gave a list of everything I had ever said to somebody that was grieving, and said, don't say any of these things. And I also don't think that's helpful, because the person, like, we go with what we have, and if those are the things, and if that gives the person a chance to be a little mad, that might be okay too. So I think we have to walk that line in between, if the best I've got is, I think God is taking care of this person.
Yeah.
Remember that might not be received well, but if that's all I've got in the moment, one person that will be a gift for, another won't be.
Absolutely.
So I think,
absolutely. That's where every person is so different. I would always encourage trying to validate the emotion before that piece of it, right? To say, like, I can really see you're grieving, I can really see you're hurt, right? I can't imagine what you're going through right now. And that piece, right? I would always look for, because if we're just throwing those cliches and the things out, that's where we're invalidating the emotions, and it's that, again, move on, right? You're fine, that sort of thing. But if we can at least add that part of, wow, that must be so hard, right? I can't imagine what you're going through. And, right, then that's going to be likely received better. But again, it's being in touch with, how does this person feel, right? How can we label that for them? How can we validate, recognize that? And then we can add those pieces, right? But again, all of those cliches and advice pieces are because we want that person to get better. We want them to feel better. We don't want you to be sad, right? And that's not what people typically need in that grief. It's sitting in the mud, sitting in that emotion with them. That's really important. Does that make sense? And so, where to find help? So, lots of different options depending on the kind of support you're looking for. So, there's counseling, right? If you're going to go see a counselor, so someone like myself, Garden Families Counseling, you guys are lucky in Guelph. So there's Andrea Warnick, who is like foremost specialist on grief that I learned a ton of stuff for. Her practice is in Guelph. And so she is absolutely one of the, I would say at least provincial, if not Canada, leading specialists when it comes to grief. And so they've got some really good stuff there. There's also My Life Counseling in Guelph is a great place. But then you've got some more community organizations. So hospice can be a really great support. Sometimes some limits. So hospice typically won't support around maid deaths, suicides, unexpected like car accident deaths, that sort of thing. Typically hospice focuses on people who've had like an end-of-life terminal diagnosis, only because they only have so much money. They can't do it all. So typically hospice has to kind of focus in a little bit. And so they'll send you to kind of some other supports if you're reaching out to hospice. But they do have a lot of counseling, they have a lot of support groups, that sort of thing. I'm not as familiar with Wellington, I support in Waterloo, but I'm sure Wellington has a lot of those same kinds of things. But just recognizing they might not be able to support with all types of deaths. Just because they are not provincially funded, and it's all fundraising. So, Bereaved Families of Ontario is another larger organization. They typically have local groups as well, so lots of support groups there. that sort of thing. There is a difference between like individual counseling and support groups, right? There's going to be a different experience there. Individual counseling is obviously going to be very focused on you. Support groups can be really great to see I'm not alone. There's other people who are experiencing this. On the flip side, you run the risk of I don't fit in, I'm not the same, right? Like, so there's a little bit of both there, but sometimes they can be super helpful to see that you're not alone, right? That there are other people who can experience this. Ontario Health at Home used to be called LIN, used to be called CCAC. They've changed their name a million times, so I'm pretty sure this is their current name. So they have some good supports too. They were running a maid support group at one point, that sort of thing. So you can always check in with them in terms of what supports they have available as well. So those are kind of your like physical in-person supports in the area. There's tons of online stuff. So anybody who's tech savvy enough to jump on there, mygrief.ca, paid and virtual hospice is one of my favorites. They've got some really cool stuff on there, both for adults and for kids, so it can support that way. They've got some really cool videos that are like culturally based sometimes and understanding different pieces that way. Again, looking for that sense of community, that I'm not alone, other people experience this, that sort of thing. Center for Prolonged Grief, it's American, but that's kind of the center for that extended grief thing, right? When people are being diagnosed with that, there is a center there that has some really cool resources. For MAID loss, Bridge to 14 is the lead organization that provides a number of virtual drop-in groups for people either anticipating or having experienced a MAID's death. And then the Suicide Prevention Council has some really good resources for any suicide deaths and groups that way.
If you've never been to counseling and you're grieving and you try to get in touch with people, what's going to happen?
Absolutely, the counseling process. So most counseling places are going to do what's called like an intake or like a screening process. So what you do is you call or email them, connect with them over the phone, and they'll typically say like, what are you looking for, right? Like, what's pushed you to get counseling? What are you hoping for out of counseling? And then when are you available? Book you in with somebody, right? And so in those calls, I encourage people to ask questions about the counselor. What's their approach? What's their style? What's their personality? What's their experience? Right? What is that going to look like? So we would get set up with counseling. Typically, people offer counseling by phone, on virtual sessions, or in person. So most counseling places are pretty flexible that way, and you can choose whatever your preference is. And then in your first session, when you actually go meet with that counselor for the first time, usually that first session is going to be about same kind of thing, like, what are you here for? What are you looking for? What are you struggling with? I always explain to clients is that first session is I'm looking to get a bit of a snapshot of your life. What's going on for you? Because sometimes we don't recognize how different parts of our life can impact, right? I've had many clients come in that say, you know, I'm struggling to parent my kid, and in that first conversation, we'll be like, oh yeah, my dad died 6 months ago. Bingo, right? Like, this is where we can experience things, and so typically that first session is all about get to know you, get to know the counselor, get their style, that sort of thing. And then within that, they'll talk about like, what are our goals, right? What are we working on? So I have some people who come to counseling with like, I want to fix X, Y, Z. Cool, we can work on that. I also have people who come to counseling that are just like, just need a place. Just need someone to talk to. I just need to unload. I've got a number of clients that I literally just come and like, call it word vomit. Like, this is my life right now, and they're looking for that person. It's like, man, that sucks. That's really hard, right? And just having that safe space. So most counseling places are pretty open to in terms of what are you looking for, right? And how can we support you in that? I will say when it comes to counseling, there's been a number of studies done, like everyone, like for counseling, there's different modalities they're called. So there can be cognitive behavior therapy, or dialectical behavior therapy, or narrative therapy, or there's all sorts of therapies out there. But there's been so many research studies that show the outcomes of therapy depend mainly on your connection with the counselor. It comes down to that relationship piece, and it doesn't matter what modality is being used. You need a counselor who you feel comfortable with. If you are holding back, or I don't want them to judge me, or I don't think I should share this, you're not going to get what you need out of it, right? And so It might take you 5 tries to find that counselor that you click with, right? You might find her on your first try, but that is what's going to be the most important piece. So don't get hung up on awards and certificates and modalities and that sort of thing. You're looking for someone you can relate to, that you feel comfortable with, and that's where you're going to get your money's worth out of counseling, because that's where you're going to get the most outcomes, right, and changes. Is that helpful? Any questions about that? Or any of it?
So I was interested in the piece about anticipatory grief, because I definitely experienced that with my dad. The other part is kind of, but it's multi-layered. So I left my job, I moved back, in with him, cared for him for 6 months. So you don't realize that, I think by the end of that time before he died, I was realizing that I was experiencing, I know what the term was, grief. And other people, the family doctor realized it when she said, do you think you need respite time? Of course I said no, which is probably the typical reaction. The other time that it really bothered me, my aunt and uncle visited from out west. And so they hadn't been here for any of this lead up. None of the illness, none of the diagnosis, none of this. And by that time, my dad had stopped eating. And of course, they basically gave me all the rules, lectures, helpful things that you should be doing this, you should be trying this. And finally, I got angry with them. I've been through all this. You know, so I'd like to just touch a little bit on that multi-layer dimension and the anticipatory part.
Absolutely. And so I think, like you said, it creeps up on us, right? We don't necessarily recognize the layers of grief that can happen, right? And so the number of times that it is, like, not only do we have this terminal diagnosis of this person we love, but we're giving up our job, right? We're changing how we live. All of those kinds of things really does add to those layers. And so, you know, when we think about those grief jars, we've got multiple balls in there then, right? And so it really does have a bit of an exponential experience, right? It's not just layers per se, but things can really build because it's another loss and another loss and another loss, right? And so, again, a lot of people don't recognize that it is a piece, and then so professionals are, like the doctors, able to pick up on some of those things. But sometimes we don't want to recognize it, right? Like you said, nope,
I'm
don't
strong, I can do it.
Yeah, because that's society's expectations, right? And so, again, the world that we live in here in North America, those are the expectations. Suck it up, move on, keep going, be strong, right? Whereas other cultures have such a different experience in that, you know, we can openly mourn, and there's places that, you know, you're not mourning if you're not screaming at the funeral, right? And like, that is how they do it, whereas we just, suck it up, move on. And yes, that applies to grief, that applies to everything in North American culture. It's all about strength and individualism and those sorts of things, and we're not a collectivist culture, right? And so, being able to be in touch with ourselves is going to be helpful, right? And trying to shift that narrative in our heads from we need to be strong, we need to move on, to saying, no, it's okay. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel this. It's okay to need a break. It's okay to need some respite, that sort of thing. It doesn't make us weak, but we might need to accept that recognizing our faults or our weaknesses or our needs actually can make us stronger. Right? And so being able to shift that. When it comes to that anticipatory grief, again, often not recognized, right? We often are so busy in that, what paperwork, and when's the next doctor appointment, and where do I have to get, and what's the next med, and right, like when we're doing that caregiving role, we're busy in the practical tasks. So our ability to recognize that we're grieving often will come as we're trying to fall asleep, right? How many times do people lay there thinking, right? After such a busy day, and then we actually slow down. Falling asleep is one of the hardest parts of the day because there's nothing to distract our brains, right? That is the time where we get to sit in our brains as we try to fall asleep, right? And so those are the times we're like, wow, when Dad dies, what am I gonna do with the house, right? What am I gonna do with myself? What am I gonna do with my time if I left my job? Like, now what, right? And so those are the times we might get a little bit of a peek of that anticipatory grief. It's also gonna sneak out. We have those aunts and uncles, or we have those healthcare professionals that make a comment about the future, right? what are we gonna do when they die, right? What's gonna happen next? And so, yeah, we're gonna rent this hospital bed, but what do we do afterwards, right? It's gonna be those moments sometimes that anticipatory grief is gonna peak up as we're like, oh yeah, there's an after, right? And so it's often, anticipatory grief is often not recognized until after. So, but it's there, right? And so, honestly, I hadn't heard of anticipatory grief until I started my training either. And so trying to just, again, that knowledge is such power, right? So knowing this now, if and or when you experience grief next, you might be able to recognize it a little bit ahead of time to say, oh yeah, this is that anticipatory grief. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments?
A couple things, if I can remember my thoughts here. The keeping connected idea, if that connection has been broken, I'm thinking of a friend who passed a couple of years ago, and I'm feeling guilty because after some initial support, I have not connected and checked in with their spouse. Is it
Never too late. Never too late, right? And you can even, like, again, be honest. Hey, I was at a grief presentation this weekend and it got me thinking of you, right? Like, people, again, the world moves on. And so if this is years down the road, guarantee he's still grieving, right? And so to have somebody recognize that years down the road is likely going to be fairly impactful.
And thank you for acknowledging the importance of pets in our lives as well. And my question is not meant to minimize those who have lost real people in their lives. From the perspective of children, so brief background, we look after our grandchildren a couple of days a week, and they're in the farm, so our dog is their dog, vice versa. So we had to have her put down this summer. So we have her out in the backyard buried, and her here made me a nice sign with her name on it. So we look out the window having lunch, we can see where she is. So the 4-year-old Alec asked on Friday at lunchtime, he made some comment about Lady, and I'd like to see her. Children must have a lot of curiosity about the after part of death and that loss. So we had a little discussion of, well, what could possibly be, left of her. But just wondering if some of your thoughts on
Absolutely.
Children's side, because that's been their only loss, but at some point there will be people loss.
Absolutely.
Children's questions, I'm sure we're not necessarily good at handling.
And I could do a whole presentation on children in grief. And so when it comes to kids in grief, that is a prime space that we talk about the culture in North America and get over the grief. Kids are the next culture, the next society. So if we can start to have those conversations with them to help them recognize grief and loss and understand death so that it's not such a big scary thing, that's what's going to change society overall. And so when it comes to kids, talk to them. Don't hide it. Like, loss is real. There is a bit of a developmental stage that it's kind of that, I'm doing my memory here, between like 4 and 6 years old, I would say, kids start to recognize the permanence of death. Prior to that, kids are like, oh, like the spider I squished yesterday's back. Like, they don't understand quite that permanence of death. And kids are super creative. So I had an example Andrew Warnick shared of, people say their bodies are buried, right? And so when we say their bodies are buried or their bodies are under the gravestone, she's had kids say, well, what about their head? Head is part of the body, right? Like, but kids hear body and are very literal around it, right? And so we want to be able to speak to kids about death and loss. This is a real part of life, right? Just like when we talk about the birds and the bees and how people are born, right? We need to have that education. And so being able to say, yes, Lady died, right? We have so many euphemisms for death, right? They kicked the bucket, or they're gone, or right, like there's so many euphemisms. But call it as it is, right? Yes, they died. No, we can't see her running around again, right? We can see her in our memories, we can see her in our pictures. No, we can't see her again, right? And it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be sad that you won't get to see Lady again, right? So we want to try and be open with them, share factual information with them, and validate that emotion, right? And it's okay to feel this way. We don't have to fix it. Lady's not coming back. Yes, it's sad. Absolutely, I miss her. That makes sense, right? Like, and we can sit in that piece of it. But to be honest about, yes, this is what happens. So for myself, in Waterloo, I back on the Bechtel Park with the cemetery there and the crematorium, right? And so my kids growing up there, well, what's that? It is a crematorium. That is where people get cremated into ashes after they die. Funny story. It was last year, maybe 2 years ago, driving out that country, St. Jacob's Way, and there was a sugar shack smoking. So I said to the kids, so what do you think's happening over there? Oh yeah, they thought it was a crematorium. I was like, okay, no, we're done with this game, guys. Nope, sugar shack, forget it. Right, but it's that death is natural. And so if we can have those conversations, that can help with that anticipatory grief too. When it comes to kids, speak their language, look at their developmental stages, and honor them, right? And I really encourage when it comes to kids, watch your own biases and your own feelings and make sure we're not making decisions for our kids based on our own feelings, right? And then can we put that aside a little bit and say, what does this kid need?
Kids sure have a different perspective. Heather's brother died about 6 years ago quite suddenly, and about 2 days after the funeral, little John was about 6 at the time, he's lying on the carpet with his hands crossed and his eyes closed. I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm pretending to be Uncle Phil. And that has stuck in my head for 6 years.
And that is normal, right? That is kids processing. Yeah.
And Max, whose grandfather died, Heather's dad collected a lot of junk and had a farm, and he'd go to the junkyard once a week. And the day after Herbie passed away, Max says, now we play with all this junk. So you never know what's going on in their head. But what I was going to say, I find both with my parents and my in-laws, it was a year for me that the first birthday, the first anniversary, the first Christmas, and after that first year went by where you thought about, well, this was my mom's birthday on December 11th. This is what we did at Christmas. The second year, it almost seemed like I was past that whole grieving. And I talked to several people my age, and they say, yeah, it was always that first birthday, first anniversary, first Christmas. And then in the second year, it seemed to almost dissolve, and you forgot that, you know, that was their birthday or their Christmas that we'd done, because time is kind of that great healer.
Yeah, absolutely, it has an impact, right? And so when we look at those first, that's where, it's going to take me forever to get back to that graph, but the idea that it spikes again, the grief spikes around that 1 year, right? Because it is all of those first Christmas without, first birthday without, first, right? And so we see that spike in grief, and so, thank you. So that's where we kind of see around that 1 year mark that will come up. Part of that is, yes, it's harder for the first time without that person, but then we also typically shift or make new traditions when it comes to that. And so when, yeah, we can't have Christmas at Grandma's because Grandma died last year. So we're starting some new traditions. So that first year, yes, is hard, it's new. That second year might not be as hard because we started those new traditions, right? And so that makes a lot of sense then when you experience that, and that's where that graph typically comes down. But yeah, that 1 year mark, it can be a real challenge.
Knowing all of this and like feeling like things are normal makes grieving a lot easier. I had grief before I learned all this at school and grief after, and it was definitely a lot easier to cope after. But there's a lot of people in our society who don't have this knowledge, but when they're grieving, trying to explain all of this to them probably isn't helpful. So how do you know like when you should share information, when you should be pushing people to get help or to try something different?
Yeah.
And like how do you be helpful when people are going through all that?
For sure. When it comes to that, I always challenge what's your role in the relationship? What is your relationship? What is your job? Is it your job to be a friend? Is it your job to be a counselor? Right? And so a lot of people take it on themselves to say, I need to fix my friend. I need to help my friend. Likely what they need is just a friend. So, and so when it comes to that balance, I would really challenge, what is your role in that relationship? And so we might have that knowledge, but it might not be your job to share that, right? And so that's where, how can you be a friend to say, you know, there is some information out there, there might be some help out there, I'm maybe not the person to give that to you, but here's some resources, right? And so that's where I would see that kind of challenge. Depending on your relationship, yeah, you might be able to share some of that information, but typically I would revert back to, what's my role, what's my job in this relationship? And if it's my job to be a friend, then just be a friend. Don't be a counselor, don't be a teacher, just be a friend. Okay. One more question there?
I just finished reading a book, and it's taken me almost 2 years to get through it, because I haven't stopped thinking about it, and it just, and by now there's the pressure, because I promised to do a friend, but it's okay that you're not okay.
Yep.
Which is
By Megan
coping with
Devine,
grief
right?
for a society that doesn't know what to do with you,
Yes.
kind of thing, so.
Yes.
And one of the chapters I think that struck me most was coping with grief rearranges your address book. Particularly impactful.
Right.
Just resonated.
Absolutely, right? And that's where those people show up or don't show up, right? When you're grieving.
Exactly.
It's surprising, and it rearranges, our address book. I'm about 75% through that book right now, so so I have a decent idea. Definitely a good book when you're looking for validation. That book, again, It's Okay to Not Be Okay by Megan Devine. As a therapist, I was looking more for, like, what do we do with this? So, but it's a great book for that if you're looking to feel normal or feel understood in the grief.
It's very validating.
Absolutely. The whole first half of the book is about, this is normal, society sucks. Like, it's a great book for that sort of thing. I'm not a huge person on, like, here, go read this book, so I don't even have, like, a list of books, but I'm, like I said, I'm currently working through that one, so that one's not a bad one if you're looking for that validation. If you're looking for the fix, that book's not going to do it.
She doesn't promise that.
Right, exactly. That's not the purpose of the book, right? That's not the job of that book, so. Awesome.
My brother died in November, so the first Christmas was like a mountain. How are we ever going to get through Christmas? So just to John's point, every family, people are different. And we were very busy that Christmas. We had lots of company, things to do. I mean, we had to be very busy. So when it was over, it's like, well, we survived Christmas. So the second Christmas, what felt heavier, it hit harder,
Absolutely.
was the second one.
That makes sense, right? Especially with Christmas having been right after the death, right? We're still climbing, and still, you were in that bottoming out period, right, as it comes, and so, that second Christmas is closer to that 1 year mark, right, where we're starting to actually feel those pieces, so that absolutely makes sense. And again, you're focused on that forward-facing, move forward, do Christmas, right, we're in that practical piece of it, so yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of time for emotion or energy for emotion in there, the same way, right, absolutely.
One thing that we didn't talk about is funerals and rituals, and you said we didn't do it well. I don't think we did it well in the past, and then COVID disrupted it all. And so a funeral at least made a place where people felt they had to go so they could see you. Like I said, if they didn't see you at the funeral visitation, they're afraid to talk to you in the store because they think they've let you down, all of those things. And COVID's been the great disruptor because there is no one way to do it anymore.
Right.
You can celebrate a life, you can have we had a lovely circle for Diane May downstairs, and people just greeted Paul in a familiar space. And so there's all these different ways of doing it, and I said, so we've been freed up, we don't have to do it the same way, but there is value in doing it together, to making that place where people can come. And so
For sure, there's a reason that funerals happen, connection. Right? Again, funeral's not about that person who died. It's about who's left behind. How do we grieve? How do we cope? How do we support each other, right? One thing I learned once upon a time, the idea of funerals at a funeral home versus, again, going back years, decades, etc., funerals or viewings or wakes would happen in the home, right? And so a book I had read talked about living rooms, the word living room, and having a living room is actually left behind from the times when we would have wakes and funerals in our home. That room would be that special room in the home for that experience. But when funerals moved to this commercial-based funeral homes, it doesn't need to be the wake room anymore. Now it's the living room, the room of the living, right? And so that has stuck with me forever. Like, that is so interesting, right? But society shifts, right? And so there was a time when all funerals and wakes happened in home, right? It's become commercialized and moving into funeral homes, which is good and bad, and it's a sign of the times. But I think, yeah, you're right, with COVID, we've really opened up to, it doesn't have to be this formal funeral thing anymore. And I think just the advancement of society and the multicultural experiences that we have now, that we don't necessarily even need a funeral, right? Like, there's celebrations of life happening now. There's, you know, memorials, and it's not necessarily in a church like would have been experienced years ago, right? There's so many different ways. But again, it's, you know, people present it as it's about the person who died. Really, it's about us and our grief, same as graveyards, right? And it's about how do we cope, how do we find community and connectedness, and how do we reforge different relationships.
If you want to leave instructions for your family about what happens after your death, go ahead. I will tell them to ignore them if it's not good for them. It's wonderful to know what somebody wanted, but it's really important to do what's for the folks that are living.
Absolutely.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Kendra. It's good to have you back with us and share all your knowledge, and I have this little gift for you. Lots of treats.
The pub rents disappeared so fast.
So those are from Barb, over there, and Liz made some muffins this year, and some pickles you'll recognize.
Those also real good.
Up there? Yeah. Being directed. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And there is time. I think Kendra can stay if you want to ask specific questions. And there will be a recording so that you can go back, or if you know of somebody that would like to watch it. You know, and remember, on YouTube, there's always that fast forward feature, so you can put it up to 2 times and skip through and then slow it down when you got the piece you want to hear or whatever. So we invite you to do that. A reminder that March 1st is our next conversation with Michael Van Hoosling, and we're talking about waste and using it as a resource, and we're looking forward to that. Then 3 weeks later, March 22nd, we've got Deb Stanson coming to talk about Habitat for Humanity, and we know they do amazing work, so just hearing how we can make more housing for those in need. April 12th, Julie Martin is going to talk about hospice, so in the rural area, so we're looking towards that. And the final one is Lisa's going to do some tech. So in that case, bring your device if you want to, bring your questions, give them to her ahead of time, and we'll make it very personal. So, and the other sides are for if we have folks here that don't know our churches, to know who we're supporting and what it means to be a part of this congregation is to be a part of reaching out into the community. So, and that's important for you. Yeah. So.
You said not. You should have changed it for this week. There's no church at Rockwood.
Yes, there's no church at Rockwood, but so thanks so much for being here, and come and enjoy some food and fellowship. And if you're interested, Spiritual Saturday is going to start sometime after we finish meeting with each other. So thanks, everybody.